Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games is Lit 101. The game we're looking at today has a fairly complicated legacy. It was a pleasant surprise for critics, was overlooked by most players, and has since become something of a polarizing force between people who appreciate its subversive nature and those who feel unfairly targeted by it. Spec Ops: The Line was released in 2012 by Jaeger Development and published by 2K. It made a big splash on release because, at risk of being a little reductive, it was a big surprise. Its namesake, Spec Ops, was a tactical shooter series from the days of the PS1 that never really made much of an impact next to the giants of the shooter genre at the time, like Medal of Honor or Rainbow Six. In 2012, rebooting the series while Call of Duty still held the industry in a vice-like grip, there was little indication The Line would be anything more than another middle-of-the-road shooter trying too hard to beat other, more popular games. The developers tried to tell us it was more than meets the eye, but we've been hurt like that before, and the game's long development time managed to pretty much erase it from most people's memory before release, so their assurances mostly fell on deaf ears. So when it turned out less like a knockoff of Call of Duty and more like a full-throated indictment of it, critics and players alike were so surprised that it got a ton of positive coverage despite its Metascore of 76, fairly average in the topsy-turvy world of video game review scores, and its low sales. But its player-critical meta-commentary remains a point of contention to this day, and has become a more common sticking point as the game ages. Spec Ops: The Line is available on PC, PS3, and Xbox 360 if you'd like to check it out for yourself, which I do highly recommend before watching this video. I know I say this every time, but this really is one of those games that greatly benefits from being played, not just being watched or, hearing me explain it to you. I'm going to analyze the story in full detail, so if anything that I'm saying here sounds even remotely interesting to you, I highly recommend getting the game and playing it before watching the rest of the video. I promise you won't regret it. Also, quick content warning. I generally try to keep Games is Lit 101 accessible to all ages and walks of life. But Spec Ops: The Line is a fairly dark and mature game with a good deal of violent imagery, harsh language, and subject matter such as PTSD and suicide. Some of this is going to be in this video, often discussed in detail, so watch at your own discretion. And lastly, there is already a lot of material out there digging deep into this game, so I've compiled a list of things that I personally found helpful or insightful while I was researching for this video, and I have linked to them in the description. So if you're interested in learning more about the game once this video is over, I definitely recommend checking those out. So let's dive in. We're going to summarize the story, talk about the novella and film that inspired it, and go into the game's metatextual commentary on the game industry and our own playing habits. So let's descend into the heart of darkness and pretend to be heroes for a while. This is Spec Ops: The Line. The game begins with its protagonist, Captain Martin Walker, musing about a man he greatly respects named John Conrad.
Is John Conrad the greatest man I ever served with? Well, I don't know. There was this one time in Kabul when he dragged my bleeding carcass half a mile to an evac chopper. So maybe I'm biased.
But Conrad has recently disappeared in the wake of calamitous sandstorms that have been outright burying the city of Dubai. He volunteered his battalion, the 33rd Infantry, to help organize an evacuation from the city. But the sandstorm has effectively blocked all communication into or out of Dubai, and the only thing to come through in months was a patchy distress call.
This is Colonel John Conrad, United States Army. The evacuation of Dubai ended in complete failure. Death toll, too many.
Captain Walker is sent into the city for a simple recon mission. With him are the other two members of Delta Squad, Adams, the seasoned veteran, and Lugo, the relatively inexperienced and light-hearted marksman. They soon encounter refugees who are armed, on edge, and speaking their own language, which no one in Delta Squad fully understands. The player can play it safe or fire first, but inevitably, conflict breaks out, and Delta pushes their way into the city. It becomes clear that there are indeed survivors in Dubai, but there are also multiple factions that have turned the place into a war zone. The player mostly fights local insurgents until they come across Conrad's 33rd.
Those were soldiers, our own guys.
It was self-defense.
Doesn't make me feel any better.
It's not supposed to.
This is the first major departure from genre for this game. The player finds themselves killing Conrad's 33rd, American troops. This is very abnormal for these military shooters and is very much meant to make the attentive player uncomfortable and to separate the game from the nationalistic patriotism that tends to permeate the genre. But nonetheless, if the player doesn't fight back, they die, so gotta just keep on shooting and progress through the game. The next while is a slow process of coming to understand what happened in Dubai and what the current situation is. It seems that Dubai's famously corrupt government got out before things got bad, and when Conrad arrived, rather than evacuate the city, he declared martial law, and the 33rd has been doing some rather unsavory things to maintain it. In response, there's an insurgence of Dubai citizens trying to fight back against the 33rd. To further complicate matters, there are CIA agents around too, and they seem to be encouraging the people of Dubai to violently resist the 33rd's control. The negative contributions of the 33rd become increasingly hard to deny, and Walker is forced to accept that his admired Conrad is responsible for much of the chaos they're seeing. As they continue shooting their way through the city, there are a few key developments. As a general rule, Delta tends to be treated as a threat, even when they're trying to save the people of Dubai from the 33rd, which is confusing, but due to the language barrier, they don't understand why, so they keep on going. But most notable is the appearance of the Radio Man, who seems to be broadcasting all across Dubai and playing some kind of organizational and observational role for the 33rd.
I mean, come on. You didn't actually think we'd just let you walk in here, did you?
Eventually, Delta catches up to a CIA agent named Gould. They're hoping to get some answers out of him, but he's being held by the 33rd along with some civilians, and the player is given a choice to prioritize them or Gould. They can choose to shoot the soldiers interrogating him, or they can sneak around to try and free the civilians before an open firefight breaks out. This scenario can play out a number of ways, but however it goes, Gould is killed, and Delta Squad is left without any information he may have had. And the pressure of the whole situation starts to incite conflict between the squad mates. Adams is beginning to take issue with what they're doing, and Lugo begins to crack under the pressure of being in a situation they weren't prepared for, but Walker remains steadfast in their mission. Delta Squad comes to an area called the Gate, basically a passage through two large, dramatically framed buildings through which one must pass to get further into the city. But it's heavily guarded by the 33rd. It's clear that Delta won't be able to shoot their way through, so they use an alternative. The white phosphorus mortar the 33rd has positioned overlooking the area. Now this is the scene. If you've been spoiled on anything about this game without actually having played it for yourself, this is probably it. The scene where the game takes a hard left turn, tips its hand, and brings into clarity what it's going to actually be doing over the course of this story. First of all, it's worth noting that this has been foreshadowed. In just the previous chapter, the 33rd used white phosphorus against the insurgents, not even to win the battle, just to make a point. So by this time, we already know the 33rd has white phosphorus and has been using it against their enemies. We've also seen the devastation it can cause, having walked through the remains after that attack. For those unfamiliar with military weaponry and surrounding controversies, the short version is that the use of white phosphorus in incendiary weapons causes severe burns and is heavily regulated in its military usage. Its use in weaponry has been rather controversial, so the game is quite intentionally tapping into this controversy by invoking this material and the suffering caused by it. And notably, they did it before an actual Call of Duty game just straight up unironically used it as a multiplayer perk. The game is alluding to real-world controversy here to help ground its commentary on war and American interventionism. If we're familiar with this controversy, then we know that every enemy we kill here is not simply dying, but dying in a particularly painful and brutal way that a lot of people, actual people in real life, have argued is too inhumane for use in war. It just helps it feel that much more real and that much more awful. The dialogue leading up to this scene sets up one of the game's most important recurring concepts.
You've seen what this shit does. You know we
Might not have a choice, Lugo.
There's always a choice.
No, there's really not.
The player will hear that a lot. We have no choice. This sentiment is echoed not only by Walker over the course of the game, but also, on a more meta level, by many of its players and its critics, so it's worth keeping in mind as we go through this story. We have no choice. After this sequence, the player rappels down and walks through the carnage of white phosphorus once again, this time carnage of their own doing, until they get through the area and realize their mistake.
Are those civilians?
Where'd they come from? There's no camp here.
They took him from the nest.
That hotel back at the storm wall? No, those can't be the civvies that got kidnapped.
Yep, the 33rd had been gathering civilians, not to kill them, but to try and protect them. And those civilians were right here. And we just used a famously inhumane weapon to kill them all. There's no denying that Delta Squad is not helping things at this point, but Walker continues to claim his hand was forced, and sets out to deliver justice to the one he views as responsible.
It's Conrad. He did it. All of it.
As we continue forward, our enemies call us murderers as they shoot at us. We may not feel responsible for what we did, but they certainly see us that way. This is one of the major turning points for the game, and also the point at which a gradual change progresses rather sharply. Walker's behavior becomes significantly more aggressive as the game continues. Listen to the way he talks early in the game.
Open fire! He's done! Target neutralized! Enemy down!
Now compare it to how he talks after the white phosphorus scene.
Kill is fucking confirmed! Fuck you! Got the son of a bitch!
Compare the executions early in the game. To the ones later on.
Son of a bitch!
Even just look at his face. This is as good a time as any to give a quick shout out to Nolan North. Yes, that Nolan North, for what I think is definitely the just most incredible performance of his career. This is hands down his most emotive, intense, and believable performance since Portal 2. His portrayal of Walker's increasing disconnection from reality and descent into single-minded violence is just one of the best vocal performances I've heard in gaming, which is why when I had an opportunity to get his autograph at a con, I got it on Spec Ops The Line instead of Uncharted or something. I may have just wanted to show off this autograph. I'm really happy I have it. Soon after all this, Delta comes across some dead men, and Conrad himself makes contact to explain that they were the leaders of a mutiny that split the 33rd into two factions: the Exiles, who sided with the civilians against Conrad's military occupation and are the people we've mostly been encountering so far, and the Damned 33rd, the group loyal to Conrad. And now that we've effectively burned through the Exiles, you know, the people who were actually trying to help, Conrad is reaching out more directly with his own voice and his loyal troops. What responds is another one of the game's choices, in which Conrad is basically playing mind games with Walker by arbitrarily forcing him to make a judgment call. In any case, Walker's goal is now to depose Conrad and put an end to the hold he has on Dubai. An opportunity soon presents itself in the form of CIA agent Riggs, who has a plan to steal the city's supply of clean water and cripple the Damned 33rd's operations. Despite Riggs being kind of shady and Adams and Lugo being progressively more vocal about their hesitations, we go along with this plan. But the heist goes wrong, and rather than let the insurgents take the water trucks, Riggs intentionally crashes and destroys them. This, it turns out, is fine by Riggs. The CIA's goal here wasn't to take down Conrad or bring stability, but to erase the situation so the US military's involvement in the mess wouldn't come to light. Destroying the water supply works just as well as stealing it. We've condemned the people of Dubai to die of thirst. No witnesses. And again, another choice. Riggs is trapped under a burning vehicle, and Walker has a gun with a single bullet. He'll die no matter what, but we can mercy kill him, or let him burn to death. The radio man begins spreading the news via his broadcast. At this point, Walker's plan is to find the radio man, hijack his equipment to tell the people of Dubai that they're here to get them out, and to bring Conrad and the 33rd to justice before leaving with the remaining refugees. So they seek out the radio man, who spends much of this time taunting them over the radio with some disturbingly jovial and even kind of self-aware references.
What are the 8 scariest words in the English language? We're Delta Force, and we're here to save you. I always love that one. This is, after all, a family program. Rated E for everyone thirsty.
It's worth noting that this segment also begins to feature some clear hallucinations, like this time when these statues have glowing cracks reminiscent of white phosphorus scars, and this time when the player is trying to shoot an enemy in a mall while lights flash and Walker keeps shooting mannequins instead. There's a lot of this stuff, but the overall point is that Walker is kind of losing his grasp on reality.
Walker, what are you doing? Adams, you can't do this, man. Stop! Just fucking stop! Damn it, Walker! No! Jesus! What the fuck did you do, Walker?
Hey, you caught me off guard.
When we finally make our way to the radio man, Lugo begins trying to hijack his equipment, finding it can only broadcast within Dubai itself. Then Lugo, previously the laid-back jokester of the bunch, does this.
You are live and on the air, my good man. Give it a shot.
Wow, that was easier than I expected. Thanks.
So Delta leaves, but not before Conrad tells Walker that he tried evacuating, and it just got people killed. That everything we're doing right now won't work, and there's no reason for it. But of course, Conrad is the villain, so why would we believe anything he says? Delta leaves on a helicopter, destroying the radio man's tower and heading towards Conrad's base in the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, albeit redesigned for this game. But a sandstorm overwhelms them and crashes the helicopter, and Walker wakes up to a hallucination.
There were over 5,000 people alive in Dubai the day before you arrived. How many are alive today, I wonder? How many will be alive tomorrow? I thought my duty was to protect this city from the storm. I was wrong. I have to protect it from you.
When he comes back to reality, he's separated from Adams and Lugo. He finds Adams, but by the time they reach Lugo, the locals have lynched him. After walking through this refugee camp and seeing the squalor in which they live, we continue toward Conrad. Walker continues to hallucinate, most notably when an enemy bursts through a door and Walker sees and hears him as Lugo.
Don't you get it? It's all a lie! No! You no fucking hero!
Throughout this, Adams is getting more and more fed up and nihilistic, and eventually, he's exhausted enough with Walker's insistence on continuing that when they're surrounded in a bad situation, he throws Walker down to the last stretch before the Burj Khalifa and stays behind, both to give him time and, presumably, to get himself killed and end this nightmare.
I'm sorry, Walker. But you knew it would end this way. Your friends dead. The world on fire. And you alone.
So at this point, Walker is the only surviving member of Delta Squad. Pretty much everyone else in Dubai is doomed to die, and he's finally approaching the goal we've been working toward this whole time. So, time for a climactic boss fight, so we can finally emerge victorious as the hero of Dubai, right? The lobby of the tower is disconcertingly calm and serene after everything we've seen, but the flanking seawater still makes that piece feel fragile, almost oppressive. A few men, all that's left of the damned 33rd, let Walker into an elevator, and he goes up to the top of the building to confront Conrad. But Conrad is dead. He's always been dead. He killed himself, unable to handle the suffering he caused, unable to justify the action he took and the lives it cost, and Walker has been hallucinating him the entire time, driving himself toward a goal that didn't exist, blaming a ghost for his own wrongdoings. We are now faced with the game's penultimate choice. Either letting Conrad shoot Walker, or having Walker shoot himself, will result in an ending with Walker dead and Dubai burning.
The United States Army has evacuation of Dubai ended in complete failure. Death toll too many.
Shooting Conrad will break the illusion.
No matter what happens next, don't be too hard on yourself. Even now,
After all you've done, you can still go home. Lucky you.
Walker, finally recognizing the harm he has caused, will radio out a message to go through when the storm fades.
This is Captain Martin Walker, requesting immediate evacuation of Dubai. Survivors. One too many.
In this case, there's one more sequence where soldiers come to pick Walker up after the storm has calmed, at which point there are 3 more possible endings. One where Walker kills them all, ending the game on a bookend.
We heard shots. Is everything okay? Sergeant Roberts, what is going on?
Gentlemen, welcome to Dubai.
Another where the player simply walks peacefully toward the soldiers and goes with them to return home.
You know, Captain, we drove through this whole city to find you. We saw things. If you don't mind me asking, what was it like? How'd you survive all this?
Who said I did?
And finally, Walker can attack the soldiers but die in the process.
Remember back in Kabul, John? Before things got bad? We were talking. About nothing, really. I said something about going home, and you said...
Home? We can't go home. There is a line men like us have to cross. If we're lucky, we do what's necessary and then we die. No, all I really want, Captain, is peace.
So yeah, not exactly a cheerful game, but there is a lot to talk about. We've got a few things to address before getting into the basic thematic breakdown, where we're going to talk about this story in relation to the stories it's based on. And then we're going to get into the game's most famous element, its meta-commentary on the nature of our relationship to video games. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the story isn't necessarily as straightforward as it may seem, which admittedly isn't even that straightforward in the first place, but still. The lead writer, Walt Williams, presented what he described as his own personal understanding of the story, though was also quite careful not to overwrite anyone else's interpretation. The game uses fade to black transitions fairly often, but it also fades to white on occasion. The keen player might notice that, generally speaking, the fade to black happens during normal transitions, while the fade to white tends to happen when Walker is hallucinating. And nearly every transition after the helicopter crash is a fade to white. One thing I didn't note in the summary is that the game technically starts in medias res with a flash forward to this helicopter chase. But Williams believes Walker died in the helicopter crash during the opening, and the rest of the game is his dying mind torturing him by reliving these experiences, which explains this bit when we get back into the helicopter turret sequence partway through the game.
Wait, this isn't right!
Well, it's too late now!
No, I mean, we did this already!
What do you mean?
Fuck it! It's nothing! Just shake these fucking guys!
In this reading, Walker eventually comes to accept the horrible things he did by way of an imagined encounter with Conrad before he dies. Less commonly known is that, in his book Significance Zero, Williams explains how this reading came to be. The game hadn't been made to open with the helicopter chase in the first place, but it was an executive decision beyond his control, and he really didn't like it. So he wrote in those lines for the second time through, and decided that everyone dies in the plane crash. Now, this interpretation works, and I'm not going to say that it's wrong or that you shouldn't believe it, but I will admit, I don't really like it. And a lot of the reason comes down to this one line in one of the endings.
How'd you survive all this?
Who said I did?
If Walker's been dead all along, this line is essentially a gotcha moment, one final indication in the game's otherwise most theoretically optimistic ending that he's actually been dead the whole time. And that's cool and all, but I think this line is far more interesting and meaningful as a statement on how Walker's atrocities and trauma have changed him so irrevocably that he considers himself to have essentially died back in Dubai. It's just a far more powerful and thematically appropriate ending to me, to show that even if Walker manages to resist his violent tendencies and return to civilian life, he'll never truly leave Dubai. He'll never be free of what he did here. This plays into the game's themes of PTSD and is just way more meaningful than, ooh, he's been dead the whole time! Honestly, it makes a lot more sense to know this was Williams' way of reconciling his vision with executive meddling than that it was a planned element of the story from the get-go. So yeah, I knew someone would mention it in the comments if I didn't address it in the video, so I'm not saying it's a bad take, but I am glad that Williams was so graceful in his expression of it because I'm not really its biggest fan. But nice thing is that it doesn't really affect all that much about what the game actually means, so that's all I really have to say about it. And one last thing we kind of have to address. Spec Ops: The Line has a multiplayer mode. It's not good. It wasn't developed by the same team that did the campaign. It was included as a demand from the publisher, one of very few such demands in a development process that otherwise gave them a surprising amount of freedom. Not only is it bad, but worse, it just doesn't belong in this game. It shouldn't even be here. The game's lead designer, Corey Davis, in one of my favorite quotes ever by a game designer, described it as another game rammed onto the disc like a cancerous growth, threatening to destroy the best things about the experience that the team at Jaeger put their heart and souls into creating. And he's right about that. The inclusion of a multiplayer mode that unironically rewards the act of shooting other players for fun is directly contrary to the entire point of the game, and what's worse, its poor quality negatively affected many of the game's reviews, which I understand but would nevertheless argue is more than a little unfair. So, that's a thing. It's bad, it shouldn't be there, but it also doesn't really affect the integrity of the single-player campaign on its own, any more than Avatar: The Last Airbender is sullied by the existence of the Shyamalan film. We can just pretend it doesn't exist. So then, all that said, it's time to move on to the question of what Spec Ops means, and the best place to start there is to talk about it in relation to the works that inspired it. The story of Spec Ops: The Line has two primary inspirations: Heart of Darkness, an 1899 novella by Joseph Conrad, and Apocalypse Now, a 1979 film directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Heart of Darkness is about a man named Marlowe journeying up the Congo River to find a man named Kurtz, who is broken from the ivory trading company he works for and taken a position of almost divine leadership among the locals. It is, to simplify it for brevity's sake, an indictment of imperialism and an exploration of morality and madness as it relates to civilization, and the lack of accountability when one finds themselves separated from the collective moral judgment of society for too long, even while that collective moral judgment seems to enable, consciously or not, the imperialistic conquest and general mistreatment of others that led to its events in the first place. Apocalypse Now adapts this story and theme to the Vietnam War, where a soldier named Willard is tasked with journeying up a river to assassinate Colonel Kurtz for basically the same things Kurtz did in the novella. It features many of the same themes, as the Vietnam War in particular is a perfect setting for a story about the sins of imperialism and the lack of dignity afforded to the lives, rights, and cultures of indigenous peoples, but it also uses that setting to comment on the horrors of war, then uses that commentary to further inform the story's exploration of morality and mental instability in the context of war and PTSD. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth on these. A full analysis of these two works would be worth their own videos, and ultimately, this show is about video games because that's my area of expertise. There's plenty of analysis out there on both Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now by people far more qualified than myself to talk about literature and film, respectively, so plenty of content out there for you if you want to learn more about these two stories. But despite the three different titles, Spec Ops: The Line is an adaptation of these two stories, and a basic understanding of its previous incarnations is helpful in seeing what this modern interactive retelling is trying to accomplish. Jaeger, and Williams in particular, have spoken at length about how these two stories influenced the creation of Spec Ops: The Line. There are a lot of homages and references, but the story is also a fairly direct adaptation of Apocalypse Now, And in the end, it feels like kind of a natural progression for this chain of adaptations. In broad strokes, all three stories are essentially identical. A man journeys through a wild and unfamiliar place to reach an important, respected figure and loses a degree of humanity as he's confronted with the horrors and amorality of this place and the treatment of its inhabitants at the hands of his own people. There are a number of homages and surface similarities as well. The character Conrad in Spec Ops is of course a reference to John Conrad, the author of Heart of Darkness, but it's spelled with a K instead of a C in the game as a reference to the character Kurtz, the name of Conrad's character in the previous two stories. The protagonists of the book and movie are similar and sort of combined as well. Marlowe and Willard become Martin Walker. Each also has a minor character with their profession for a name who respects Kurtz/Conrad and serves as a connection to him later in the story. The Russian trader in Heart of Darkness, the photojournalist in Apocalypse Now, and the radio man in Spec Ops. In some deeper homages, Spec Ops mirrors the progressive descent into darkness and immorality that both previous works include. The game's level design is fixated on downward motion. We're rappelling, we're ziplining, we're working down a set of stairs, always moving down but rarely moving up, and never having any protracted sequences of upward motion. This doesn't even always make sense geographically, really. Multiple times we'll be on ground level only to enter a building and come out later at the top of a skyscraper. Progression in Spec Ops: The Line is almost always a descent, and in a few specific instances a descent into darker or more hellish landscapes than before, like falling from the tower into the dark, ruined underbelly of the city, or even more graphically, the hellish imagery as we descend into a literal pit of fire of our own making. The geographical landscapes in these stories have always been symbolic to some degree. Moving further into the Congo, into Vietnam, into Dubai is a movement away from civilization, away from the rules of morality and decency, and into unpredictability, immorality, and violence. In Spec Ops, that symbolism is communicated through this constant downward motion, as well as the previously discussed ways in which Walker's behavior becomes increasingly aggressive and hateful over the course of the game. The game also mirrors its source material in its condemnation of imperialism, military adventurism, basically whatever force urges us to get involved in violent conflicts that aren't ours and cause or exacerbate problems in doing so. There's a reason Apocalypse Now is set in the Vietnam War. It's hard to deny that America has taken part in a lot of this behavior, but Vietnam is a particularly powerful example that was very fresh in our collective memory at the time the movie was released. Of course, the modern equivalent is American involvement in Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries, which is a very common setting for a great many modern shooter games, mostly seeming to glorify that military involvement rather than criticize it. So it was a natural choice for Spec Ops' setting. Thus, it shares this common thematic element. To let Conrad tell it,
You were never meant to come here.
What happened here was out of my control.
Was it? None of this would have happened if you just stopped.
all the locations in these three stories were worse off for our involvement in the first place. In all three cases, we tried to fix it by sending in even more people, and all three times, it only made things even worse. But in all three cases, there's also some reason why people are determined to stay, instead of just, backing out so they stop ruining everything. It's easy to forget as the game goes on, but listen to Delta Squad's mission.
We have our orders. Locate survivors, leave the city immediately. Radio command from outside the storm wall. Send in the cavalry, and go home.
All they had to do was basically confirm that there were still people alive in there, then leave and call for backup to come and facilitate an evacuation. When Conrad tells Walker he wasn't supposed to be here, that's not hyperbole. Everything Delta does after the opening minutes of the game is completely outside their mission parameters. But when conflict breaks out, they push forward. When they wrongfully assume they need to save people, they push forward. When the 33rd is revealed to be a source of conflict, Delta Squad pushes forward. And so long as there are enemies to shoot, the player pushes through them. Because that's how shooters work. Another correlation of note is the way Spec Ops treats its setting and native characters from Dubai. There's a decent amount of criticism out there regarding the way Heart of Darkness uses its native characters, in a way that's, unsurprising given the time the novel was written, but still doesn't age super well. They're not so much portrayed as people as objects to serve as a backdrop against which Marlowe can have his existential crises. He straight up refers to them as animals, even literal objects on more than one occasion. This is sort of baked into the premise and its core symbolism, unfortunately. Moving further into areas untouched by the protagonist's own civilization is, especially in Heart of Darkness and a bit in Apocalypse Now, associated with progression towards savagery. The book was well-meaning and even progressive for its time in calling out imperialism and inhumane treatment of Africans, but it was still steeped in a number of racist ideas that visibly affect the way it approaches these topics. All this is something of a problem, for what I hope at least are fairly obvious reasons, and it's something that Spec Ops appropriates with intentionality and self-awareness. See, the issue of essentially just using people of color and native people as backdrops for plot and violence is also a very common issue in shooters, especially the modern military genre. Since the Middle East is the current epicenter of American military conflict, many of these games take place in a country in that region, and the entire population doesn't really come across in these games as being human, so much as being targets. It doesn't help that most of these games are made in America, where we're going on 20 years now of treating every Middle Eastern person like a terrorist. This was even more true when Spec Ops was released than it is now, and the game mirrors this tendency, both as a standard for its genre and a reference to Heart of Darkness. But it's acutely aware of this, and works to both call attention to it and, later, to subvert it. It leans into it at first with the way we're expected to be less comfortable killing Americans than anyone else, but as the game progresses, we get events like the white phosphorus scene and the lynching of Lugo, making it painfully clear how much damage we're doing to the local population and centering their suffering rather than our own realizations about it. That doesn't fully solve the Heart of Darkness problem of native characters being backdrops, but it does deftly avoid casting them as the main targets in gameplay and delivers a rather sharp rebuke of its many contemporaries in the process. It also benefits from using the chaos caused by the sandstorm and the 33rd's martial takeover as the unambiguous cause of all the chaos and violence in the city. I mean, it takes place in Dubai. The city is famously politically corrupt, which the game does reference, but it's rather pointedly not a place colonialists could call uncivilized. This is one way that Spec Ops' modern military setting owes a bit more to Apocalypse Now than to Heart of Darkness, and it helps sidestep the racial issues by explicitly blaming a natural disaster, political corruption, and American interventionism rather than characterizing the place and the people in it as inherently violent and uncivilized. But all three stories also characterize the titular darkness as something that, while perhaps enabled by each story's harrowing circumstances, doesn't originate from them. It's inside all our hearts and threatens to come to the surface when we're removed from societal expectations of decorum, put in a position of power, and given an excuse to let go of our inhibitions. The theme of being forever changed by a brush with that darkness inside us has been there from the beginning, but since Apocalypse Now took place in the Vietnam War, it made a very logical step by expressing this idea through PTSD, the horrors of war, and how a person is changed by the mindsets necessary to expend so much time and energy on taking human life. Heart of Darkness already had the bit about isolation from society bringing out that darkness, and Apocalypse Now added that one inherently learns to touch that darkness, to thrive on it, in order to do what soldiers need to do.
There is a line men like us have to cross.
It seems to posit that this trauma is partially the result of growing too close to that Heart of Darkness and being permanently changed by it. Spec Ops takes on that element in a number of different ways, and each of the three main characters interact with this theme differently. Much of the game's commentary on PTSD is fairly subtle because it's focused on Walker's trauma from events before this game. But while that is important, it's also a big part of why I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this subject, because focusing too much on that element of Walker's backstory threatens to turn his arc into trauma gave him mental illness which made him a bad person, which is both a terrible mischaracterization of PTSD and seriously misses the point of the game. If I'm being honest, I'm not entirely convinced that the game deals with this subject as deeply as the discourse around it would imply. It deals with desensitization to violence and a loss of innocence, which, combined with the military setting, certainly does invoke ideas of PTSD, but I'm uncertain how much concentrated commentary there is on the subject. But I'll leave that discussion to people who actually suffer from PTSD. Check the extracurricular reading section in the description for some of that. But we do get some interesting stuff from Walker's squad mates, Adams and Lugo. Adams, unlike Walker, seems to have a relatively solid grasp on his inner darkness at the beginning, almost as though he's experienced enough with it to use it as a shield against trauma rather than a source of further trauma. So he starts out as a soldier, following orders without question, because that's what he's trained to do. This also helps him see things more clearly as the game progresses, as he becomes the main voice of reason in Delta Squad when things start getting really bad. And when he dies, it's because he no longer wants to be part of this atrocity.
Just shoot me! I'm standing right here! Come on!
Even then, he can't completely abandon his mission. He still has to help Walker toward his goal, but he's not going with him. He's done being part of this. Lugo, on the other hand, is essentially Adam's thematic foil. He follows the same arc in reverse. He's established to be relatively inexperienced, jovial, making snarky comments in all situations.
Wee! That's enough, Lugo.
I'm just keeping it light, boss.
It's another common action game trope, but Spec Ops actually acknowledges how much of this persona is a front to protect him from the reality of his job. Lugo starts out with the bigger moral compass of the team.
You're fucking kidding, right? That's white phosphorus.
Yeah, I know what it is.
You've seen what this shit does. You know we
Might
can't
not have a
use it.
choice, Lugo.
There's always a choice.
But by the end, he's shooting the radio man in the head unprovoked and going along more and more easily with Walker's orders.
Fuck you! At least I'm doing my job! You're the one who's fine, just sitting back, waiting for things to unfuck themselves!
It becomes clear that the trauma of what he's experiencing has gotten past that aloofness, and beneath that flimsy defense, Lugo is a fragile, vulnerable person. His experiences in this game are affecting him on a deep and permanent level, and his inability to healthily process them alters who he is at his core. So in the background of Walker's descent into the heart of darkness, we have Adams and Lugo undergoing opposite arcs that both end in death. One who starts off vulnerable and is broken by trauma, and another who starts off hardened and grows a conscience from trauma. And of course, they both represent parts of Walker as well, Adams representing his control and Lugo his innocence. Both are lost as the game progresses and Walker further disconnects from reality. Of course, each of these retellings uses a different medium. We have a book, a movie, and then a video game, which means they all bring different things to the table. Heart of Darkness focuses a lot on Marlowe's inner thoughts and how he processes what's going on around him. Apocalypse Now focuses on the use of imagery to communicate abstractness, darkness, detachment from reality, and moral ambiguity. This is one of the most fascinating things about adaptation in general, to me at least, the way that different art forms can sort of bring out different themes in the same story. All three versions of this story play to the strengths of their medium and have slightly different thematic focuses as a result. With each version of this story, we see the protagonist get progressively closer and closer to the titular darkness. In Heart of Darkness, Marlowe sees it, feels it, and returns home shaken and unsure of how to really process what he experienced. Apocalypse Now takes this further by suggesting that Willard's act of killing Kurtz was itself giving into the same darkness as Kurtz himself, and while it ends with him leaving to return home, it very strongly indicates that no return home will undo that damage. In both cases, the darkness is inside the protagonists, and they see how easy it can be to give into it given the right catalyst. Spec Ops, on a purely narratological level, is very much the same as Apocalypse Now. Walker will either die in Dubai or live to return home with such deep scars that he doesn't even consider himself to have truly survived at all. But, as with many good video game stories, it takes things one step further by utilizing the player's interaction to add another layer of meaning. Spec Ops has its own ideas about the nature and reason behind this disconnect from reality and descent into immorality, the catalyst that sends one down into their inner demons. Heart of Darkness pins it on the separation from the developed world. Apocalypse Now pins it on the horrors of war, but Spec Ops pins it more on well-intentioned entitlement, a desperation to matter and a blind dedication to pushing forward, heedless of context or consequence. If there's any one simple narrative change that separates Spec Ops thematically from its predecessors, it's the twist that Conrad is actually dead, and the voice that Walker's been hearing has been in his head the whole time. In both Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now, the protagonist is something of an everyman, through which we can see how Kurtz has essentially created his own reality, drunk on power and exploiting the people around him for his own personal gain, and ideally, feel ourselves come uncomfortably close to that false reality by proxy, to barely escape its dark grasp. Kurtz is as much a person as he is a metaphor for the darkness within the protagonist, within everyone, and an illustration of how easy it can be to succumb to it. But Spec Ops isn't about seeing someone else's depravity, it's about facing our own. Marlowe may see the darkness in Conrad, and Willard may tap into it, but Walker is Conrad. Conrad's darkness is his own. and in an interactive medium, it is also, by proxy, ours. Spec Ops may be an adaptation of these older stories, but it's also fundamentally a criticism of its own genre and the dominance of military shooters surrounding its release, so we've got some context to go over. The genre Spec Ops both belongs to and criticizes was basically single-handedly created by Infinity Ward's Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare in 2007. Modern Warfare took the series out of the World War II setting that had once dominated the first-person shooter market, placing it in modern day and basing it off modern conflict and weaponry. The game cemented the turn of the shooter genre towards immersive war simulation with exciting set pieces, and that legacy is the main thing that's lived on from the game, basically dictating the next decade plus of shooters and really the direction of the entire industry. It was as formative as any influential game can possibly be. For all intents and purposes, to reference the modern military genre is to reference Call of Duty 4. Gigantic entertainment enterprises like the AAA game industry are famous for learning the wrong lessons from success. The setting, aesthetic, and gameplay principles they took from Modern Warfare were definitely the right ones for their bottom line, but in the process, they, and much of the gaming community as a whole, forgot that Call of Duty 4 was actually quite cynical about war in many ways. The Extracurricular Reading section has a link to a video that goes into more detail about the message of Call of Duty 4 if you're interested, but suffice it to say, the game isn't as gleefully uncritical of its subject matter as you might expect. But the effect Call of Duty had on the industry, and most of its players too, probably, if we're being honest, ignored those thematic elements in favor of the big set pieces that made war thrilling and glorious, and the multiplayer innovations that made shooting your friends over the internet more fun and rewarding. A long string of games tried to mimic the same formula, mostly without success. Call of Duty's own constant sequels have generally been a downward slide, not helped by Infinity Ward hemorrhaging much of its biggest talent to form Respawn Entertainment in 2010. Some old series tried to make comebacks, too. Battlefield had a number of failures until it shifted its focus to historical vignettes and large-scale multiplayer warfare, and Medal of Honor, well...
Medal of Honor, Darth Vader, kicking down doors wherever we go.
I don't think it ever came close. Meanwhile, the basic design principles and mechanics snuck their way into the sci-fi genres that Halo had once dominated, giving us games like Respawn's own Titanfall and even, to precisely no one's joy, Halo 5. But regardless of success or failure, all these attempts to recapture Modern Warfare's lightning in a bottle only helped to solidify the modern concept of a military shooter. These games all have a shared identity and origin, and it's very easy to recognize if you make a habit of playing them. Which is why Spec Ops essentially disguises itself as just another knockoff for the first few hours of play. This is most easily seen in the game's mechanics and presentation, which are all fine but don't particularly stand out among the titans of the genre. And in all fairness, it might be giving the game too much credit to call the generic twitch shooting an entirely intentional design decision, but we see it in the story too. The early hours are kind of pithy. I zoomed through the first half or so in the summary because it's just not very substantial. It's the typical gamey story structure, more about objectives than meaningful story development. The plotting, structure, writing, pacing, most of the game is modeled after the successful shooters that defined the gaming landscape into which Spec Ops was released, and that is quite intentional. Part of it is probably a matter of leaning into the game's low budget relative to mega hits of the day like Modern Warfare 2, but don't let that fool you into thinking this game isn't doing every single thing it does with an intentionality you rarely see in games, let alone this particular genre. The game sets up a facade, not just by borrowing the dusty aesthetics and general military warfare with a bunch of gruff, snarky dudes shooting realistic guns setup, but even by feeling, on a narrative level, like just about any other shooter. Minimal, meaningful movement in the story, just enough plot development to keep us shooting. The white phosphorus scene in particular is where this all comes to a head, as the entire sequence is actually based rather directly on a level from Modern Warfare. This level is called Death from Above, in which the player rains bullets and explosives down from a helicopter to provide support for troops on the ground. Like many things in modern warfare, it was heavily researched and modeled directly after actual war footage, and includes dialogue that almost makes the people causing all this death and carnage sound bored.
Yeah, clear to engage. Guy running. Get that person. Kaboom.
It's ultimately little different from the age-old tradition of turret segments, used here to highlight the detachment of soldiers from the people they're killing. But if a game and player are uncritical toward it, it's little more than a formula. We recognize it, and we don't think much of it. So, much like the rest of Spec Ops, the white phosphorus sequence is made to not inspire all that much thought at first glance. We're doing what we've done a million times in games like this, and we're doing it because it's the next adventure the game has planned for us. We have no choice. But it's also the point where it takes all that comfortable sameness and throws it in our faces. This is an intentional play on our expectations, using familiar tropes and formulas to lure the inattentive player into a false sense of security. Because Spec Ops isn't just about imperialism and warmongering, it's also about why we play video games and how we think about them. When talking about any video game story, it's important to consider not only the story itself, but how the interactivity inherent in the medium contributes to it, how the story is told, or even simply elevated by the player's involvement. If Spec Ops' nature as an interactive work brings anything to the table that previous versions of the story hadn't, it's the ability to make the equivalence of protagonist and antagonist significantly more personal. It doesn't just point to these characters and say, "This could be you." It points directly to the player and says, "This is you," because you literally just did it. What I said earlier about how the heart of darkness in Spec Ops is born of a desperation to matter, stubborn adherence to a goal, that's because it's a video game. And in video games, that's what we do. The game gives us a goal, we work toward it, and the game rewards us when we accomplish it. This is just how games are designed, at least in the significant majority and especially in the AAA space. So, to that end, Spec Ops is essentially a deconstruction of its own genre, masquerading as yet another all-too-typical military shooter before revealing its true intentions as a horror game that is quite disdainful of its own kind. And what exactly is it criticizing? Spec Ops: The Line's commentary on video games is primarily concerned with the nature of the violent power fantasy, the way video games use violence to empower their players. And while I would hardly call the game ham-fisted, it does make this point with all the subtlety of a freight train to the gut. The white phosphorus scene may get the most attention because, in all fairness, it is where the game most loudly demands it. But it's the confrontation between Walker and Conrad at the end that truly defines Spec Ops: The Line. The entire ending sequence is basically a speech delivered directly to the player, blaming them for everything they've done in the game and criticizing their motivations. This is the crux of Spec Ops' message, and also, perhaps unsurprisingly, the most contentious element of its storytelling. See, Spec Ops believes that video games can affect us, and since it apparently still needs to be said, no, obviously playing a bunch of shooters isn't going to suddenly inspire us to go murder people, and that's not what this game is trying to say. Stories inherently present and espouse a worldview. They communicate ideas, and when a game is designed around using violence to accomplish goals and progress through the game, and when that design is specifically meant to reward the player, both mechanically in-game and psychologically through its design, for inflicting that violence, that is a worldview that we implicitly accept while playing. That violence solves our problems, and doing so is exciting, satisfying, even heroic. And since games are generally designed around the player to make them feel powerful and accomplished and entertained, that implicit message shifts slightly. Not only does violence solve our problems, but violence is how we interact with the world. It's how we matter. Dominance is how we mean something. Regardless of narrative context, no matter how silly or bloodless the game, this is an implicit, inherent message of any video game that centers around violent action. Spec Ops thinks that's kind of not great, and it says as much rather blatantly in some of its loading screens, which change as the game goes on, using the space usually reserved for gameplay tips or world-building details to challenge our complacency. The game's major thematic takeaway from Heart of Darkness is that we are all capable of depraved acts given the right circumstances and a mindset that allows us to justify and act on the darkness within us. Spec Ops wants to force us to acknowledge the hero fantasy these games cater to as a form of that justification. Again, not that they will somehow make us violent, but that they're a channel through which we reach inward and touch that dark part of ourselves. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, and that's one of the things that art can help us do, is give us a safe way to explore the darker elements of the human experience and better understand ourselves and humanity for it. I think it's actually rather important and beneficial. But that's not how shooters generally want us to approach war and violence. They're designed to be fun and rewarding, so we can just have a great time mowing down baddies. Spec Ops: The Line seems to be arguing that to reach so thoughtlessly into our Heart of Darkness, to go to that place without any critical examination of why it's there and what it means, is perhaps a little irresponsible. This is commentary on how games are designed, but the more powerful message here is, I think, directed not at the industry, but at the player, at us. The game's metaphor on this level is fairly clear by the end, I think. Conrad is the developer, and Walker is the player. To quote Walt Williams directly, Spec Ops: The Line wasn't a war story. It was the story of you and me. The game even explicitly puts us in the opening credits, and the message is clear. This is our story. Walker can blame Conrad for what happened all he wants, but he's the one who kept pushing forward. And we can blame Jaeger Development for the atrocities we committed in Spec Ops, but the events of The Line don't happen without a player to play it. We can say the game forced our hand. We can say there wasn't any other choice. We can repeat all the same things that Walker himself spends the entire game saying to make him feel better about what he did. But in the end, we did still do this. But this sounds kind of unfair, right? We didn't choose to kill civilians with white phosphorus. We didn't choose to damn Dubai to die of thirst. We didn't even choose to play a game about committing awful war crimes. Jaeger kind of tricked us into playing a game where all these things happen. I mean, if it's going to guilt trip us for all this, at least it could have let us choose not to do it, right? But player choice isn't something that can just be inserted into any video game to make it better. It changes the way a game is communicating its ideas, and sometimes even what ideas it's communicating in the first place. Spec Ops: The Line does have a number of instances of player choice, but they serve a very specific purpose. Allowing the player to avoid the worst of Walker's atrocities would completely change what this game is trying to say. Spec Ops: The Line is in no small part about imperialism and military interventionism, like the stories it's based on. Allowing the player to just choose not to do the bad things would completely miss the point, because all of this is bad. The game's choices exist to give the player opportunities to think more deeply about their experience. There's a reason there are no prompts, no morality meters, just an opportunity to shoot first or see if they do. To shoot into the crowd, into the air, or let yourself be killed by pelting stones. To end a monster's suffering or let him die an excruciating death. To see how long you can fight a losing battle before resorting to white phosphorus. To decide whether to go home, massacre your rescue party, or even die trying. All the game's choices have an obvious path laid out ahead of you, but secretly have no rules enforcing you to follow them, because it's not so much about your ability to change the story or make good choices, as it is about whether you're even considering that you should be looking for solutions outside of the game's explicit instructions. That plays to the game's themes. But the entire point here is that war is bad, and the game is incredibly critical of any attempts to contextualize it in a positive light. Allowing the player to make morally good choices in how they enact genocide and mindless military violence would be inherently contradictory. Like, what? You wanted the option to be a good, upright, moral conqueror of this disaster zone? There's no such thing. That's what Spec Ops is saying. So no, letting the player choose not to do war crimes would not fix Spec Ops. If anything, it would be quite the opposite. But that doesn't really change the criticism that the game unfairly targets players for doing things that the game led them to do. But what if Spec Ops isn't criticizing the player for doing the things they do in the game? What if instead it's criticizing us for our attitude going into it? In a quote that's shockingly relevant to Spec Ops, considering it was said decades earlier, when asked about whether Apocalypse Now was an anti-war film, Coppola responded, "I feel any artist making a film about war, by necessity will make an anti-war film, and all war films are usually that. My film is more of an anti-lie film, in that the fact that a culture can lie about what's really going on in warfare, that people are being brutalized, tortured, maimed, and killed, and somehow present this as moral, is what horrifies me, and perpetuates the possibility of war." We could get hung up on Conrad saying,
"None of this would have happened if you just stopped."
As though the game doesn't want us to play this or any other violent game, but I think that's focusing on the wrong line. What I find far more central to the game's message is a line we've heard a few times already.
"You're here because you wanted to feel like something you're not, a hero."
Spec Ops: The Line is absolutely a player-critical game, but it's not critical of the fact that we simply played through its twisted and violent scenarios. It's critical of the fact that we went into this war game expecting that murdering countless people would make us a heroic figure. All that to say, Spec Ops is not a game about why we do bad things in video games. It's about our attitudes towards the games we play. It's about why we play games about waging war, about murdering people, and uncritically expect the game to validate, congratulate, and empower us for doing so. There's a scene in the director's cut of Apocalypse Now that takes place over dinner in a French plantation deep in the Vietnam jungle. The whole scene is basically the family's veneer of respectability breaking down over the course of dinner as they discuss all the bad things that have happened to them and all the reasons they're miserable here. But the patriarch of the family insists that they belong here anyway, that this land is theirs and they deserve to thrive.
See, Captain, when my grandfather, my uncle father came here, there was nothing. The Vietnamese were nothing. So we worked hard. Very hard. We brought the rubber from Brazil and then planted it here. We took the Vietnamese, work with them, make something out of nothing. So when you ask me why we want to stay here, Captain, we want to stay here because it's ours, it belongs to us. It keeps our family together.
There's a reason this sequence was cut from the theatrical release of the movie. It's a little overlong and really just kind of interrupts the pacing of the movie's third act descent into dark surrealism, but nevertheless, it might be my favorite scene. It's fascinating to see this family fall apart over what they admit are immense hardships that make life miserable for everyone involved, with no reprieve or reward in sight, but they still insist that they stick to it for little more reason than a sense of entitlement. This land isn't even theirs, really. They just came and built on it because they thought they could make money off it, and they don't regard the natives as having property rights. There's no real reason for them to expect that this plantation is rightfully theirs. They just think that's how the world works. They're a bunch of rich, privileged people. They're used to the world bending over backwards to accommodate them, and they don't know how to respond when it doesn't, except for indignant stubbornness. They insist that they deserve to be treated with deference and respect, no matter how obviously that just isn't how this works. Obviously, there's a lot here about colonialism, privilege, and the sort of manifest destiny-like way these people think about their presence in someone else's country. And as part of a story based on Heart of Darkness, it's all endlessly fascinating to me. But I can't help but feel that that sense of entitlement, that they're somehow owed affirmation and success, kind of relates to the way we tend to play video games, too. When we step into the shoes of a protagonist in a game, we expect certain things from the game's creator. We're going to play their game. run through this scenario they've cooked up for us, play in the space they've made us, and in turn, they're going to reward our effort with affirmation. In game design terms, this is called a positive feedback loop, and it's foundational to good game design. It's as simple as the satisfying sound of a shattering shield when we deal enough damage to make our enemy vulnerable, or as complex as a happy ending to the story when we overcome all the game's challenges. The game is constantly letting us know, in countless small and big ways, that we did a good job, that the things we're doing are good and right and impressive, and we should feel proud and accomplished for doing them. Sometimes, though, a game betrays that trust. Spec Ops is not the first to do this. Shadow of the Colossus did it years before, and The Last of Us did it just a year later. But these games take responsibility for it. It's a twist, a tragedy, a narrative turn to make a point and make you feel something. And they work splendidly. But Spec Ops breaks this pact entirely. The gameplay obviously does include these loops. Completing a scenario gives you access to the next one. Hitting an enemy has a visible impact to let you know you've succeeded, and Walker continuously provides the player a narrative reason to keep playing. But in the end, Spec Ops has no intention of telling the player they did a good job. Walt Williams has described video game stories as propaganda, a spin on what the player is doing in the game to give them a justification for the harm and pain and death they're dealing. I, he said, am the minister of propaganda to the game's one true ruler, that person-shaped void we call the player. Spec Ops is very much like every other game you've played except this one thing. The story refuses to serve the purpose of affirming and praising our actions. It doesn't try to spin the story in our favor. We're here because we wanted to feel like a hero. But Spec Ops has no interest in making us feel like one. Spec Ops definitely wants to make us feel uncomfortable with the things we do in the game, but not because it thinks we're responsible for them. It's because we went into the game expecting it to hold up its end of a bargain that we take for granted, and the game wants us to confront and reevaluate the bargain itself. Ultimately, what is this but the stripping of context from gameplay? Stories in video games essentially began as little more than an attempt to give rationale to the player for what they're doing in the game. Save the princess, beat the bad guys, get to this location, blow up that important thing. Story wasn't its own end, it was a means to an end. It was context, it was motivation, it was justification for your in-game actions. Williams' use of the word propaganda might have been a tad hyperbolic, but it's not inaccurate. And however far we've come before and even after Spec Ops, a lot of game stories are still kind of designed around this principle, giving context to gameplay, because without some kind of justification, shooting hundreds of human beings in the head just kind of feels like we're doing something awful. Because we kind of are. So Spec Ops removes that context. It doesn't sugarcoat anything for us. It lets us carry out our duty, progress through the game like we always do, like all our years of playing these games have trained us to do, but in the end, it refuses to tell us what a great person we are for it. Spec Ops is a trick, and it's a guilt trip, but that's only a vehicle to a larger point. It's not a condemnation of the player. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to think more deeply about our relationship with the games we play, to stop stumbling blindly through these experiences for a few hours of mindless entertainment and start considering what they mean to us and why we're playing them. Spec Ops doesn't want us to feel bad for the games we play, it just wants us to think about them. And honestly, viewed from this angle, I don't see Spec Ops: The Line as tearing down the player. It's critical of us, sure, but if anything, it takes the empty sense of empowerment so central to most game design and tears off the veil. It brings attention to it so we can actually examine it. We, the players, can change how we approach the games we play. We can be more mindful about how we feel and why we play. We can better understand ourselves through these games. And Spec Ops wants to help us do that by pushing past our assumptions and showing us something most games try more than anything to make invisible. And I'll end on this thought. If there is one weakness to Spec Ops' approach to choice and subversion that I definitely recognize, it's that the game has, in all likelihood, dated itself by tricking the player the way it does. Its criticism of the shooter genre and the way games are designed to enable the player to justify anything they do is absolutely still relevant, perhaps even more so now than in 2012. And as long as that's true, the game's call for the player to be more mindful about their motivations and feelings as they play will be relevant as well. But to make that point, the game expects the player to mindlessly slog through its levels and set pieces and cutscenes without giving much thought to what they're doing or why, so that it can then turn that mindlessness around on us and make its point. And in the time and context in which this game was released, it works rather brilliantly. I'd argue it works even now, for the most part. Probably will for a while to come, too. But in a world where players are more critical of their experiences and put more thought into their actions as they play a game, it might not. Spec Ops: The Line could not exist, or at the very least would not be nearly as effective if critical thinking about video games were as widespread and developed as it wants it to be. It is, essentially, a game advocating for its own obsolescence. So it is my deepest hope that as time goes on, Spec Ops: The Line won't work. That when people play this game decades from now, they'll catch on to what the game is doing long before it expects them to, and they'll have to understand the context in which it was created and the state of the gaming industry and community at the time if they want to fully grasp what made it so evocative. Because the great thing is, even if it doesn't come across well when that day comes, Spec Ops: The Line will have had no small part in bringing it about. So I say, worth it. Hey, thanks for watching this video. It's been a long time coming. Sorry it took so long. I don't really have an excuse, just... sorry. But I've got plenty more content on the way, so keep an eye out for that. Make sure to subscribe and hit that little bell if you want to know when it happens. If you liked this video and want to support the Games is Lit 101 channel, check out the Patreon. Link is in the description. You can get early access to all new content, membership to an exclusive and rather wholesome Discord community, and early access to scripts before I commit them to film. Speaking of patrons, they should be scrolling by the screen by now. Couldn't do this without you all, seriously. Thanks so much for your support. You all are the best. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and I hope to see you around.